Welcome to This is Growing Old, the podcast all about the universal human experience of aging. My name is Katie Riley, Vice President of Communications at the Alliance for Aging Research, and I'll be your host today. On this episode, we're going to talk about fall prevention. Falls are the leading cause of accidental injury and death in adults over age 65. But unlike medical conditions and ailments that may arise as we age, falls are preventable. I'm pleased to introduce today's guest, my former colleague and friend, Dr. Scott Trudeau, who is an occupational therapist with more than 40 years in the field, much of which he has specialized in fall prevention, home modification, and community mobility for older adults. He is currently the Director of Practice Engagement at the American Occupational Therapy Association. As an occupational therapist, he focuses on everyday occupations, the activities that occupy our time, and how to help older adults to not only feel safer, more independent, and confident in their daily lives, but to thrive in place. Dr. Trudeau, Scott, thank you for joining us today.
Thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Why don't we jump right into the questions? We're in the season of fall. It's a great time to think about fall prevention in the sense of avoiding falls and tripping and falling. So all of us trip and fall at times. It's something that happens to some more than others on a daily basis. What is it about aging that causes this risk to increase?
So the risk increases with aging, but as you mentioned in the intro, it's really important to understand that falls in general are preventable. So those risk factors really become critical to understand. So things like deteriorating strength, deteriorating balance, changes in sensory perceptions, visual or hearing, can sometimes set up situations where we might be more prone to miscues in our environment and have a problem. But there are things we can do about it, right? So if we think about things like strength and balance, you can do exercise, you can get out and walk, you can do more activity to actually help you address that. So there's no, aging has an increase in those risk factors, but it's not sort of a direct causal effect, right? So it's not because I am a certain age, I am more likely to fall. It's a much more complex equation, and we have to think about all the variables that are going to actually contribute to, am I personally at risk of a fall? Just because I'm 72 doesn't mean I'm at risk for a fall if I'm, fit and active and have thought about how I set up my environment so that I don't trip over things. That's going to go a long way to preventing those falls.
Great. And how about medical conditions that increase fall risk? We know occupational therapy practitioners look at the whole person. So they may be working with someone on a specific medical condition and be addressing fall risk during that intervention. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So that's the other contributor, right? As we age, we often tend to accumulate more chronic conditions, more, I may now have diabetes or hypertension or things that I may not have experienced when I was younger or didn't bother to go to the doctor to notice when I was younger. And so now that I'm older, I'm going to have more of these things to contend with. Well, with additional diagnoses, often comes additional medications. And medications and interactions with medications can be a huge contributor to falls risk. Whenever we talk about blood pressure is an important factor in terms of fall risk, because if we get up too fast and our blood pressure drops, and so do we, that's a high risk for falls. Well, that may be exacerbated or made worse by the fact that we're on blood pressure medication and the timing of when we take that blood pressure medication. All of these factors, right, have to be weighed in and considered when you're looking at that. Now, more specific to your question, right? When an OT is working with somebody who's had a major acute situation, so a medical condition that has come up, which is not one of these more chronic, insidious kinds of things, but it's something big like a stroke or a cardiac event, that process of rebuilding your strength and rebuilding your balance and being able to tolerate sitting at the edge of the bed, not even getting up, all of that is going to be challenged. And all of the factors that we've already talked about are going to contribute to that, right? So I may be on all sorts of different medications that my body's never had to deal with. So I don't even know, my body doesn't even know how to adjust when I sit up. So I have to be very careful that I don't pass out or I don't lose my balance on the edge of the bed, those kinds of things. So I think it's the one trap to all of these conversations for me is always one size just doesn't fit all, and how important it is to understand the constellation of factors that an individual is dealing with that would increase or decrease their personal fall risk. And so that's why when we look at, checklists online, they're very helpful. They're a helpful thing to start with, but they don't often help you to individualize your own personal risk as much as you might benefit from. So there is a falls-free checklist that the National Council on Aging has, and now I think CDC is actually getting involved in working with the National Council on this as well. That checklist can be a great starting point for people to identify that they may be at risk for a fall. But then what, right? Then what's your next step? So you've got to figure out then how do you activate getting more information, getting an evaluation done by a healthcare provider that's going to actually help you to address some of those risk factors. So it's not just it's not an easy thing to fix, but it's really critical to keep going back to what you said at the beginning. Falls should be preventable in most situations. So we should be able to figure out. And you mentioned earlier that, when people may sort of in the course of their routine experience a fall, that too is one of those risk factors. That's a really important risk factor. If you have fallen in the past, you're more likely to fall again, unless you address the reason why you fell in the first place. And that becomes really critical to sort of understand. I also use the term near miss with people when I work with them. So you may not have fallen all the way to the floor. You may not have, broken a bone or had a more significant incident. But if you've, found as you were standing up from the chair, you kind of fell back down into the chair and you didn't hurt yourself, but that's a near miss. That's a warning flag that people want to be taking note of and understanding, well, if it could happen, then it might happen again, but it might not be so lucky to just land in the chair. I might land on the floor and I need to take action. I need to think about what was going on. Why did that happen? How do I understand that? And do I need to seek help with understanding that from my healthcare team?
Yeah. And that's a great segue. I mean, you covered a lot of the whole medical reasoning for a lot of this and how that can increase your fall risk. But what about, an everyday person, like the biggest risk factors in the home? Like, what are some of those big ticket items that you evaluate when you go into a home or other OT professionals that would increase the likelihood of a trip and fall incident? And what measures can be taken to reduce those risks?
So as human beings, I think we all sort of accumulate bad habits sometimes over the years, right? So maybe I like to collect magazines, and maybe I have piles of magazines near my chair. that may be fine if they're positioned in a place and they're secured in a place where they're not going to be in your way. But that's not always the case in the way we set up our homes. We have them so that we can reach them, and I may have to walk around them to get to the chair, or I may have, and those kinds of things are the sort of simple things that we can think about: clearing pathways, clearing clutter. Again, a lot easier said than done. I've lived like this for 80 years. Why would I not want to have that where I can access it the way I always have? Why should I have to move it? So it's not easy to make some of these changes, which sound simple, right? Just clear the environment, clear up all the clutter. But that has important implications for individuals sometimes. The other thing that I often think about when I think sort of globally about fall risk is lighting. And again, we all sort of have patterns of how much light do I use, how much electricity do I use, all of those kinds of things come into play. And I say to people all the time, and this was true in my clinical work a few years ago, so I bet it probably hasn't changed a whole lot. People get very concerned when you talk about increasing lighting because they see that as increasing the cost of electricity in their home, and for some people that's a real challenge. But there's these nifty things that technology has invented called LED lights, which allow you to get better illumination with less electricity use. And there's a few things that I particularly like from a safety perspective about LED lighting. One is that they burn cool. So I don't know if you've ever gone to change a light bulb after it's burnt out and you don't even think because it's not on anymore, and you just touch it and it's hot. You burn yourself. These don't do that. They don't get hot. So if God forbid a curtain should be sitting on it, it's not gonna light on fire, those kinds of things. So that's a good safety trick. But the other piece of it is that they don't burn out as fast, so you don't have to change light bulbs as frequently. And again, if you have overhead lighting or if you're climbing on things to change light bulbs, you're putting yourself potentially at a risk for a fall, and not just a routine little stumble. That could be a fall off of a step ladder or off of a stool that could be more significant and could result in bigger injuries. So the more we can minimize people climbing and having to change light bulbs, that's a good thing as well.
Definitely.
So those are a couple of things. The other sort of concepts that I like people to think about is not just tolerating your environment, but actually thinking about it and setting it up. We all know there are things, I use a cast iron skillet every morning to make eggs and bacon. Just throw that out there, right? So why do I store the cast iron skillet in the cabinet that's uncomfortable for me to get at in the morning? And I'm bending over and I'm reaching and I'm lifting and leave it on the counter, leave it on the stove. It's part of my decor. I have the skillet on the stove. I don't, because the reason why I use the example of cast iron is because it's heavy. It's not an easy thing to move oftentimes. So there's no need to keep putting that away. It's the same kind of thing with, any kind of dishware or any kind of, why are things up overhead when I could put them at face value, or I could even put them on the counter to easily access them and not have to do the kinds of movements and the kind of balancing acts that we do on a routine basis just to get through the day. So those are a couple of sort of concepts that people can think about: clutter, lighting, and accessibility of the stuff that I frequently use.
Those are fantastic, just such practical tips. I mean, all of us, even if we're not really at risk for falls and we're listening to this podcast and thinking about the older people in our life, can use those same tips about keeping things accessible and handy and just make life easier too. I know one